I was still holding the second coffee when the elevator doors opened on the fourth floor at 3:09 p.m., and the smell hit me first, her rosemary perfume, faint but unmistakable, the same one she had worn for 12 years, the same one that used to fill our house every Sunday morning. And for a second, I just stood there, not moving, not breathing, because it felt like stepping into a memory that wasn't supposed to exist anymore. And the receptionist looked up from her desk and said, "Can I help you, sir?" And I nodded, still holding both cups, and said, "I'm here to see Vanessa." And she blinked, just once, then checked her screen and said, "She's not in today." And that didn't make sense. Not at 3:10 p.m. on a Tuesday. Not when she had texted me at 1:42 p.m. saying she'd be working late. And I felt something shift in my chest, small but sharp, like a lock turning, and I said, "Are you sure?" And she shrugged slightly and said, "She hasn't checked in since yesterday at 5:15, and I stood there for a moment longer, then walked past her desk without waiting for permission, because I had been in that office before, twice, maybe 3 times, and no one stopped me as I reached Suite 402 and pushed the door open slowly, the handle cold in my hand. And the first thing I noticed was the silence, complete, heavy, wrong, because her office was never silent. There was always music, low jazz, something playing from the speakers. But now there was nothing, just the hum of the building and the sound of my own breathing. And I stepped inside and placed the coffees on her desk at exactly 3:12 p.m., watching the steam rise for a second before it faded. And that's when I saw it. The pen, black lacquer, gold trim, resting slightly off-center near her laptop. And my hand stopped halfway to setting down the lid, because I knew that pen. I knew the weight of it, the exact feel, 45 grams, heavier than it should be. And I whispered, "No," under my breath, because that pen wasn't supposed to be there. It had been missing for 6 months, along with my daughter, Natalie, who disappeared on September 8th at 7:30 p.m. after sending me one last text that just said, "I'll call you later," and never did. And I stood there staring at it, my fingers tightening around the cup, then loosening again, then tightening, and I heard myself say, "This doesn't make sense," out loud, just to fill the silence, just to hear something human in that room. And I reached out slowly and picked it up, feeling the familiar weight settle into my palm, and I turned it over, just once, and there it was, the engraving still sharp, still clean, Natalie P. Exactly the way it had been 6 years ago when she gave it to me on my 50th birthday, and my throat closed, suddenly, completely, and I had to swallow twice before I could breathe again, because for a second I could hear her voice, clear, bright, saying, "Now you'll look like a real CEO, Dad." And I almost dropped the pen. Almost, but I didn't. I held on to it, tighter now, like it might disappear again if I let go. And I said, "Where have you been?" Even though I knew the pen wouldn't answer. And that's when I felt it. The smallest movement beneath my fingers, a slight shift, like something clicking into place, and I froze, completely still, because that wasn't possible. It was just a pen. It shouldn't move. It shouldn't do anything. And I whispered, "What is this?" and pressed lightly, just enough to test it. And I heard the sound, soft but unmistakable, a mechanical click from somewhere behind the wall, and I stepped back instinctively, my heart suddenly racing, too fast, too loud, and I watched as the panel behind her desk moved, not quickly, not dramatically, just a slow, deliberate shift of about 12 inches, revealing a narrow gap, dark inside. And for a second I didn't move. I just stared, trying to understand what I was seeing, because this wasn't real. This couldn't be real. And I said, "Vanessa?" Louder this time, my voice echoing slightly in the empty office, but there was no answer, just that open space behind the wall, and the smell, something faint, something unfamiliar, not rosemary, not coffee, something else. And I took one step forward, then another, each one slower than the last, and I felt my hand start to shake, just slightly, just enough to notice, and I stopped again, right at the edge of the opening, and I leaned in, just a little, trying to see inside. But it was too dark, too narrow, and I said hello. My voice lower now, controlled, like I was speaking to a stranger, like I was speaking into something I didn't understand. And then I heard it, barely audible, so soft I almost thought I imagined it. A voice, weak, strained, coming from somewhere inside that space, and it said, "Dad." And I felt everything drop, all at once. My breath, my grip, my sense of where I was. Because that voice, I knew that. Voice, I had heard it every day for 22 years, and I whispered, "Natalie." Not even sure the word came out, and the voice came again, just as faint, just as real, and it said, "Don't close it, please." And I wasn't alone anymore. It was already 4:05 p.m. when I got back into my car, parked 2 blocks away from the building, exactly 0.3 miles according to the dashboard, and I did not start the engine right away. I just sat there with both hands on the wheel, staring at nothing, because my heart was still racing too fast to think clearly, too fast to trust what I had just heard, and I said out loud, "That was not real," just to hear the words, just to test if they sounded believable, but they did not. Nothing about this made sense, and I checked the time again. 4:07 p.m. now, as if the minutes themselves could confirm reality, and I tried to slow my breathing, in and out, counting to 4, like I used to do years ago when things felt out of control. But this was different. This was not stress. This was not confusion. This was something precise, something structured, and I whispered, "Natalie," again, softer this time. And the name felt heavier than it had in months, because for 187 days that name had been attached to reports, to police files, to unanswered calls, and now it was attached to a voice behind a wall in my wife's office. And I leaned back in the seat and closed my eyes for a moment, just a moment, because I needed to see the timeline clearly. I needed numbers, facts, something solid, and I started counting backwards. September 8th, 7:30 p.m., her last text. October 2nd, first police report filed. November 15th, case downgraded to missing adult. January 12th, last official update. And through all of it, Vanessa had been calm, consistent, controlled, always speaking first, always answering before anyone asked, and I opened my eyes suddenly, because that detail landed differently now, sharper, heavier, and I said, "She always spoke first." And the realization sat there, cold and exact. And I reached for my phone at 4:12 p.m. and scrolled to Vanessa's contact, my thumb hovering over the call button for a full 5 seconds, maybe 6, before I pressed it, and it rang once, twice. Then she answered, her voice steady, familiar, unchanged. "Hey, are you still at work?" And I swallowed once before replying, keeping my voice level. "No, I just left." And there was a pause, brief but noticeable, maybe 2 seconds. Then she said, "Oh." It was already 8:06 p.m. when I saw her car leave the driveway, and I stayed inside for exactly 10 seconds before moving, counting each one under my breath, because timing mattered now. Every second mattered, and I grabbed my keys, stepped outside, and got into my car without turning on the headlights, just sitting there for a moment, watching the red glow of her taillights disappear around the corner about 120 feet away, and I whispered, "Not tonight," to myself, because whatever was happening, I needed to see it clearly, not guess, not assume, and I started the engine at 8:07 p.m., letting it idle for 2 seconds before pulling out slowly, keeping a distance of about 3 car lengths as I turned onto Maple Drive, and my hands felt steady, surprisingly steady, even though my chest was tight, even though my thoughts were moving too fast, and I told myself, this is just observation, nothing more, just like I would approach any business decision, collect data first, act later, and I followed her for 1.8 miles through residential streets, then on to Route 9, where traffic picked up slightly, enough to give me cover, and I stayed behind a silver SUV, using it as a buffer, watching her car move ahead in the right lane, consistent speed, about 42 miles per hour, no hesitation, no sudden turns, and I said quietly, "Where are you going?" Even though I knew she could not hear me, and after about 7 minutes, at exactly 8:14 p.m., she turned off the main road into an industrial area I had only seen once before, years ago, when my company evaluated a warehouse lease, and I felt that same shift again, small but sharp, like something aligning, and I slowed down, letting 2 cars pass me before following the same turn, keeping my distance now at least 60 yards, and the streetlights were dim there, spaced too far apart, leaving patches of darkness between them. And her car finally stopped in front of a building marked 2419, a warehouse with no signage, just a faded number on the metal door, and I drove past it slowly, not stopping, counting the seconds as I passed. 1, 2, 3, then turned right at the next corner, parked behind a stack of shipping containers about 80 feet away, and turned off the engine at 8:19 p.m. And for a moment, I just sat there again, listening to the silence, broken only by the ticking of the cooling engine. And I said, "You are here for a reason." Because there was no other explanation, not for this location, not at this hour, and I stepped out of the car carefully, closing the door without sound, and moved closer on foot, keeping to the shadows, stopping every few steps to check my position, my surroundings, the distance between us, and I saw her step out of the car at 8:21 p.m., her posture relaxed, her movements controlled, like this was routine, like she had done this before, and that detail landed harder than anything else, because routine meant repetition. Repetition meant time, and time meant planning, and I felt my throat tighten again, just briefly, before I forced myself to breathe, slow and steady, and I moved behind a concrete pillar about 30 feet away, just close enough to hear if voices carried. And that is when I saw him, a man stepping out from the side door of the warehouse, tall, mid-40s, maybe 6 feet, wearing a dark jacket, and he walked toward her with no hesitation, no caution, like they knew each other well, and I heard her speak first, her voice clear in the quiet air. "You are late." And the man responded immediately. Traffic was worse than expected, and I leaned slightly closer, just enough to hear more, keeping my body pressed against the cold concrete, and Vanessa said, "We do not have time for delays anymore." And the man nodded once, then said, "The documents are ready. All $3.2 million of it." And my hand tightened against the pillar, my fingers pressing into the rough surface, because that number, that exact number, I had seen it before, just hours ago, in a file I had not understood at the time, and I felt something drop again, deeper this time, heavier, and I whispered, "Stephen," under my breath, recognizing him now from an old business contact list. Stephen Hale, financial consultant, known for structuring complex asset transfers. And Vanessa continued, her tone calm, almost clinical. "He still does not suspect anything." And Stephen replied, "He will sign within 4 days." The timeline holds, and I closed my eyes for a second, just 1 second, because hearing it spoken out loud changed everything. It removed doubt. It removed interpretation. It was no longer a possibility. It was a plan, precise, timed, structured, and I opened my eyes again, forcing myself to stay present, to keep listening, and Vanessa said, 6 months was enough. We cannot extend this any longer. And Stephen hesitated, just slightly, then asked, "And the girl?" And there was a pause, a small one, maybe 2 seconds, before Vanessa answered, her voice unchanged. "She stays where she is. She is not part of the final stage." And I felt my breath stop completely, just for a moment, just long enough to register the words, and I did not move, I did not react. I just listened, because now every word mattered, every detail, and Stephen nodded slowly, then said, "All right." For days. After that, everything transfers, and Vanessa stepped closer to him, lowering her voice slightly, but not enough to lose the words entirely. After that, there is nothing left to manage, and I knew what that meant, not fully, not yet, but enough to understand the direction, the intent, and I stayed there until 8:29 p.m., watching them separate, watching her return to the car, watching him disappear back inside the warehouse, and I stepped back slowly, retracing my steps to my car, my mind already organizing what I had heard, what I had seen, what it meant, and as I reached the door and opened it quietly, my phone vibrated in my hand, once, then again, and I looked down at the screen at exactly 8:31 p.m. and saw a message from an unknown number that simply said, "If you are watching her, you are already too late." It was nearly 10:02 a.m. the next morning when I walked into Sharon Mitchell's office on West 57th Street, and the first thing I noticed was how quiet it was, not empty quiet, but controlled quiet, the kind that comes from people who listen more than they speak, and I paused just inside the doorway, adjusting my grip on the folder in my hand, because it suddenly felt heavier than it had an hour earlier, and Sharon looked up from her desk and said, "You are early," her voice steady, measured, and I nodded once and replied, "I did not sleep," which was true. I had not slept at all, not after 8:31 p.m., not after that message, and she gestured to the chair across from her and said, "Sit down, Jonathan. Start from the beginning." and I sat, placing the folder on the desk between us, opening it slowly, because I needed to move carefully now, methodically, like I would in any negotiation worth more than $1 million. And I said, I went to her office at 3:10 p.m. yesterday, and Sharon did not interrupt, did not react. She just listened, her pen moving slightly across a legal pad, and I continued. I found a hidden room. I heard my daughter's voice, and that was the first moment my voice shifted, just slightly, just enough to notice, and I stopped for 2 seconds, maybe 3, then continued. She has been missing for 187 days, and Sharon looked up then, her expression unchanged, but her eyes sharper, more focused, and she asked, "And you are certain it was her voice?" And I nodded once and said, "I have heard it for 22 years, and she held my gaze for a moment longer before saying, "All right, keep going." And I told her everything, the pen, the click, the wall, the warehouse, the man, the conversation at 8:21 p.m., the number, $3.2 million, the timeline, 4 days, and I watched her write each detail down, precise, structured, like she had done this before, many times, and when I finished, she leaned back slightly and said, "You said Stephen Hale," and I nodded, and she turned her monitor toward me, typing quickly for about 6 seconds before a file appeared on the screen, and she said, age 46, financial consultant, known for structuring layered asset transfers above $2 million. And I felt that same tightening in my chest again, sharper now, because this was no longer abstract. It was specific, documented, and Sharon continued. He has been linked to 3 prior investigations. None resulted in charges, and I said quietly, "What about Vanessa?" And that was when she paused, just briefly, before opening another file, and she turned the screen slightly again and said, "Vanessa Pierce, age 43. You met her in 2010, correct?" And I nodded, because that detail landed immediately, clear and exact. 14 years of knowing someone. And Sharon tapped the screen once and said, "Her financial history changes in 2016. And she pulled up a set of records, numbers filling the screen, columns, dates, amounts, and she pointed to one line and said, June 2016. Loss of $2.8 million in a failed startup. Bankruptcy proceedings initiated within 90 days. And I felt something inside me shift again, deeper this time, because I remembered that year. I remembered the conversations, the stress, the way she had said, "I just need time to rebuild." And I had believed her, completely, and Sharon continued. That is the trigger point. Everything changes after that. And I leaned forward slightly, studying the numbers, because they were precise, undeniable, and I said, "So this started 8 years ago?" And she nodded and replied, "Yes. And it has been consistent since then." And she clicked again, bringing up another set of documents, and she said, 3 missing persons cases. 2014, 2017, 2021. In all 3, Vanessa was one of the last known contacts, and I felt my hand tighten against the edge of the desk, my fingers pressing into the wood, because that pattern, that repetition, it was too clean, too structured to ignore. And I said, "You are telling me she has done this before." And Sharon met my eyes directly and said, "I am telling you this is not her first operation." And the word operation stayed with me, because it implied planning, structure, intent beyond money. And I sat back slowly, processing that, and I whispered, "Why?" Because that was the part one still did not understand, not fully, and Sharon did not answer immediately. She just looked at the file again, then back at me, and said, "Control." And the word landed heavier than anything else she had said, and she continued, "Money is the tool. Control is the goal. Identity, access, total influence over another person's decisions." And I felt my throat tighten again, just briefly, because that matched something I had ignored before, something small, something I had dismissed, the way she always managed conversations, always decided outcomes before they were discussed. And I said quietly, "She always needed to be in charge." And Sharon nodded once and said, "Exactly." And she reached into a drawer and pulled out a printed document, sliding it across the desk toward me. And I looked down at it, my eyes scanning the first line, then the second, then stopping completely on the third, because it was my name, my full name, and beneath it, a policy number, a date, 2 months ago, and an amount, $3.2 million, and I felt my breath stop again, just for a second, because now it was no longer a possibility, no longer a pattern, it was a plan with my name on it, and I said, "She filed this without telling me," and Sharon replied, "Yes," her voice steady, and I looked up at her and asked, "What happens in 4 days?" And she held my gaze for exactly 2 seconds before answering. "The transfer completes. And after that, you are no longer necessary." And before I could respond, before I could even process that sentence fully, her phone on the desk lit up with an incoming call, and she glanced at the screen, her expression shifting for the first time, just slightly. Then she answered and said, "Mitchell," and listened for 3 seconds, maybe 4, before her eyes moved back to me, and she said, "Say that again." And then she ended the call slowly, placing the phone down with deliberate care, and looked at me directly and said, "Someone just reported a second hidden room in that building. Same layout, same mechanism." It was 10:47 a.m. when Sharon slid a second folder across the desk, thicker than the first, and she did not say anything for 3 seconds, maybe 4, just watched me as I opened it, because she already knew what I was about to see, and I felt it before I read it. That same pressure in my chest, low and steady, like something settling into place, and I looked down at the first page, a summary sheet. Clean, structured, and the number hit me immediately. $12,400,000, total asset movement over 6 years, and I said, "That is not possible," quietly, because saying it louder would not change it. And Sharon shook her head once and said, "It is not only possible, it is documented." And I flipped the page slowly, one line at a time, because I needed to understand each number, each transfer, each date, and I saw them there. $1.2 million in 2017, $2.6 million in 2019, $3.1 million in 2021, and smaller amounts in between, structured, spaced, consistent, and I whispered, "This is a system," because that was what it looked like, not chaos, not impulse, but a pattern, and Sharon nodded and said, "Yes, a repeatable system," and I leaned back slightly, my hand still resting on the folder, and I asked, "How many?" Because I needed a number, something I could hold on to, and she answered without hesitation, "At least 3 confirmed prior cases. Possibly more," and I felt my throat tighten again, just briefly, because that word, confirmed, meant evidence, meant this was not theory anymore, and I said, "And Natalie," and my voice dropped there, just a fraction, and Sharon met my eyes and said, "She does not fit the previous pattern," and I frowned slightly and asked, "What do you mean?" And she tapped the file once and said, "In the prior cases, the targets were financial partners, adults, ages 48, 52, and 55, each with assets above $2 million, and I nodded slowly, because that aligned, that matched what I had seen, and she continued, "Your daughter is 22. She is not a financial target." And I felt something shift again, sharper this time, because that left only one explanation, and I said, "She saw something." And Sharon did not answer immediately, but her silence was enough, and I looked back down at the documents, scanning faster now, looking for anything that connected, anything that explained the deviation, and I found it 3 pages in, a note, handwritten, dated September 6th, 2 days before Natalie disappeared, and it read, "Subject. Accessed restricted file. Risk elevated." And I felt my hand stop completely, because that was not speculation, that was a record, and I said, "She found out," and Sharon nodded once and said, "That is the most likely scenario," and I closed the folder halfway, just enough to pause, just enough to breathe, and I said, "So this was not random," and Sharon replied, "Nothing about this is random," and I looked up at her again and asked, "What happens next?" Because that was the part that mattered now, not the past, not the pattern, but the next move, and she leaned forward slightly and said, "We mapped the full scope," and she pulled out a second set of documents, placing them beside the first, and I saw more numbers, more transfers, more names, and she pointed to a column and said, "These are shell accounts. 12 of them, all linked through Stephen Hale," and I followed her finger, reading each one, and the totals aligned, the structure held, and I said, "This is at least $12.4 million," and she corrected me immediately. "That is the confirmed amount. The real total is likely higher," and I felt that land, heavier than expected, because confirmed meant proven, meant this was only what they could show, not everything that existed, and I sat back again, my mind moving faster now, calculating timelines, exposure, risk, and I said, 4 days, quietly, because that was the number that mattered most now, and Sharon nodded and said, yes. 4 days until the final transfer, and I looked at the insurance document again, my name printed clearly, the amount, $3.2 million, and I said, and after that, and Sharon did not hesitate this time, she said, after that, you become a liability. And the word stayed there, heavy, precise, and I nodded once, because I understood what that meant, not in detail, not fully, but enough, and I said, then we move before that. And Sharon allowed a small pause before replying. We move carefully. And I leaned forward again, my hands steady now, more steady than they had been all morning, and I said, tell me what you need. And she looked at me for a moment, assessing, measuring, then said, access, timing, and your cooperation. And I nodded once and replied, you have all three. And she reached for her phone again, dialing a number quickly, and I listened as she spoke, her voice shifting slightly, more formal now, more direct. This is Mitchell. I need a preliminary review on a financial transfer case. Amount exceeds $10 million. Timeline is 4 days. And she paused, listening, then said, yes, I will send the documentation within the hour. And she ended the call, placing the phone back on the desk, and I exhaled slowly, because something had changed, something had moved from observation to action, and I said, so we are doing this. And Sharon looked at me and said, we are documenting this, correcting me, precisely, and I nodded, because that distinction mattered, and I reached for the folder again, closing it fully this time, because I had seen enough, I understood enough to move forward. And as I did, my phone vibrated in my pocket, once, then again, and I pulled it out at exactly 11:12 a.m., expecting another unknown number, another warning, but this time it was different. It was a message thread I recognized immediately, Natalie's number, inactive for 187 days, and my hand froze for a fraction of a second before I opened it, and there was a single new message, time-stamped 11:11 a.m., and it read, Dad, she moved me. I am not in the office anymore. It was 2:12 p.m. when I stepped back into her office, and everything felt the same silence, the same desk, the same faint scent in the air, but now I knew what was behind the wall. Now I knew what the space meant, and my hands did not shake this time. They were steady, completely steady, because I had already made the decision at 11:30 a.m., and I placed the Mont Blanc pen back on the desk exactly where I had found it, aligning it carefully, because details mattered, and I said quietly, let us finish this, even though I was alone, and I pressed the mechanism again, hearing that same soft click, watching the panel shift open about 12 inches, just enough, and I stepped back immediately, not looking inside, not this time, because this was not about discovery anymore. This was about confirmation, and I moved to the side of the room, positioning myself behind the tall cabinet about 6 feet from the wall, where I had placed the recorder at 2:05 p.m., already running, capturing everything, and I checked my watch, 2:14 p.m., and waited, just listened, because timing mattered now. And at exactly 2:19 p.m., I heard the outer door open, footsteps, measured, familiar, and her voice came first, calm, controlled. You are early. And another voice followed, Stephen, lower, steady. We do not have much time left, and I closed my eyes for 1 second, just one, because this was the moment, the point where everything moved from suspicion to proof, and I stayed still, completely still, my back against the cabinet, my breathing slow, deliberate, and Vanessa stepped further into the room, her heels soft against the floor, and she said, 4 days. That is all we need. And Stephen replied, the accounts are ready. 12 shells. Total transfer $3.2 million this cycle. And I felt that number land again, heavier this time, because now it was not just a document. It was a plan spoken out loud, and Vanessa moved closer to the desk. I could hear it, the slight shift of objects, and she said, 6 months was enough to stabilize him. He trusts the process now. And Stephen let out a short breath and said, he always does. They always do. And I felt something inside me collapse for just a second, just 1 second, because that word, always, meant repetition, meant history, meant this was not personal to her. It was a pattern, and I pressed my hand lightly against the cabinet, grounding myself, then forced my breathing back under control, because this was not the moment to react. This was the moment to listen, and Vanessa continued, her tone almost casual. After the transfer clears, there is nothing left to manage. No accounts, no signatures, no complications. And Stephen asked quietly, and him? And there was a pause, a small one, maybe 2 seconds, and then Vanessa answered, clearly, directly. He is not part of the final stage. He becomes irrelevant. And the word echoed in my head, irrelevant, precise, calculated, and Stephen shifted slightly. I could hear it. Then said, what about the girl? And Vanessa did not hesitate this time, not even for a second. She was a mistake. She saw the files. She forced the timeline forward, and I closed my eyes again, just briefly, because hearing that confirmed everything, every piece, every connection, and I felt my chest tighten, not with fear, not exactly, but with something sharper, something colder, and Vanessa continued. She is secured. Relocated this morning at 10:32 a.m. Different site. No risk of interference. And I felt that hit me harder than anything else, because it aligned perfectly with the message at 11:11 a.m., and I pressed my hand over my mouth for a second, just 1 second, because the timing was exact, too exact to ignore, and then I lowered it again, forcing myself back into control, because this was not over, not yet, and Stephen said, good. Then we proceed as planned, and Vanessa replied, we always proceed as planned, and there was a faint sound then, a drawer opening, papers shifting, and she said, for days, $3.2 million. Then everything closes, and Stephen added, and after that, no one traces it back, and Vanessa gave a soft, almost amused exhale and said, no one ever does, and I felt that line settle, deep, final, because it was not just confidence, it was certainty, built over years, over multiple cases, over at least $12.4 million, and I stayed there until 2:27 p.m., listening to every word, every movement, committing it all to memory, because I knew this was the moment that would matter later, the moment that would define everything that followed. And when their voices finally moved toward the door, when the footsteps faded, when the office returned to silence, I stepped out slowly from behind the cabinet, my hands steady, my breathing controlled, and I walked to the desk, picking up the pen again, holding it for a second longer than necessary, because now it was not just an object, it was a key, a trigger, a piece of evidence. And I whispered, for days, under my breath, because that was the window, that was the limit, and my phone vibrated in my pocket at exactly 2:29 p.m., and I pulled it out, expecting Sharon, expecting instructions, but it was a number I did not recognize, and I opened the message, and it read, you were in the room at 2:19 p.m. We saw you. It was 9 a.m. the next morning when I walked into my attorney's office on Madison Avenue, and the city outside felt louder than usual, sharper, like everything was moving too fast while I was trying to hold everything still, and I closed the door behind me slowly, taking one breath before stepping forward, because this was the moment where thinking turned into action, and my attorney, Robert Ashford, looked up from his desk and said, you look like you have not slept, and I nodded once and replied, I have not, and I placed the folder in front of him, thick, heavy, containing $12.4 million in movement, 6 years of structure, and one plan with my name on it. And I said, I need everything secured today. And he did not hesitate, not even for a second. He opened the file and began scanning, his eyes moving quickly across the pages, and after about 20 seconds he said, this is extensive, and I replied, it is complete. And he looked up at me and asked, how much time do we have? And I answered, for days. And he leaned back, slightly, considering that, then said, then we do not wait. And he reached for his phone, dialing immediately, and I heard him say, initiate trust transfer, full asset protection, all accounts, effective immediately. And he paused, listening, then added, yes, all $8.7 million. Move it now. And I felt that number settle, because it was the portion I could control, the portion still within reach, and I sat down across from him, my hands steady, my voice calm, because this was what I knew how to do. This was structure. This was execution. and I said, I also need legal separation filed today. And he nodded and replied, grounds? And I answered, fraud, conspiracy, financial exploitation. And he wrote it down without question, then said, we will file at 11:30 a.m. And I checked my watch, 9:12 a.m., because every minute mattered now, every detail, and I leaned forward slightly and said, there is more. And I explained the recording, the warehouse, the relocation at 10:32 a.m., the message at 2:29 p.m., and Robert listened carefully, his expression tightening just slightly as the details aligned. And when I finished, he said, you are not just dealing with civil exposure. And I nodded and replied, I know. And he picked up his phone again and dialed a second number, and I heard him say, this is Ashford. I need federal contact. Financial crime. Multi-million-dollar exposure. Immediate review. And he paused, then added, yes. Today. And he ended the call, placing the phone down with deliberate care, and looked at me directly and said, you understand what this becomes if confirmed. And I held his gaze and said, I already do. And there was a brief silence, maybe 3 seconds, because we both understood the weight of it. And then I stood up slowly, adjusting my jacket, because there was one more step, one more move that needed to happen before everything shifted. And I said, I am meeting her at 12:15 p.m. And Robert frowned slightly and asked, alone? And I nodded and replied, she expects compliance. And he shook his head once and said, then you give her performance, not truth. And I allowed a small pause before answering, that is exactly what I intend. And I left his office at 9:27 a.m., stepping back into the noise of the city, but everything felt quieter now, more controlled, because the plan was in motion. And at 12:14 p.m. I was standing in our kitchen, exactly where she expected me to be, the house silent except for the ticking clock on the wall. And I heard the front door open at 12:15 p.m., her footsteps measured, familiar, and she walked in, setting her bag down on the table, and she looked at me with that same calm expression and said, you are home early. And I nodded once and replied, I cleared my schedule. And she studied me for a second, maybe 2, then smiled slightly and said, good. We have paperwork to finalize. And I stepped closer, keeping my voice even, controlled, and said, I know. And she tilted her head just slightly and asked, do you? And I held her gaze and said, you said 4 days. I prefer to move faster. And there was a pause then, a small one, but enough to register, enough to confirm she understood what I was doing. And she smiled again, but this time it did not reach her eyes, and she said, you have always been efficient. And I replied, it is why you chose me. And her expression shifted, just slightly, just enough to notice, and she stepped closer, lowering her voice and said, you think you understand what is happening? And I did not answer immediately. I let the silence sit for 1 second, maybe 2, then said, I understand enough. And she studied me again, longer this time, then asked, enough to sign? And I nodded once and said, enough to finish it. And she turned toward the table, opening her folder, pulling out the documents, and she said, then let us not waste time. And I stepped closer, watching her hands, steady, precise, as she placed the papers in front of me. And I reached for the pen, the same pen, feeling its weight again. And for a moment, everything slowed, just slightly, just enough for me to see it clearly, the pattern, the structure, the plan. And I looked up at her and said quietly, you planned this for 6 years. And she did not deny it. She did not hesitate. She simply said, I perfected it. And the word landed, sharp, final. And I held her gaze for 1 second longer before placing the pen down on the table, not signing, not yet. And in that moment, my phone vibrated in my pocket, once, then again, and I pulled it out slowly, looking at the screen at exactly 12:18 p.m., and it was a message from Sharon, and it read, we have confirmation. The second location is active right now. She did not look at my phone when it vibrated at 12:18 p.m., not at first. She just watched my face, her eyes narrowing slightly, like she was measuring something, recalculating, and I felt it immediately, that shift in her posture, that change in the room, and I kept my expression neutral, controlled, because this was the moment where one mistake would cost everything. And I lowered the phone slowly, placing it face down on the table, and she smiled, just slightly, then said, you are distracted. And I shook my head once and replied, just business. And she held my gaze for a second longer, then said, everything is business. And that line landed differently now, heavier, more precise, and I nodded once and said, that is what you taught me. And she tilted her head slightly, studying me, then asked, and what have you learned? And I let 2 seconds pass, just enough to feel the weight of it, then answered, timing matters. And her smile faded, not completely, but enough to notice. And she stepped closer, placing one hand on the table, steady, deliberate, and said, you are not supposed to think about timing. And I met her eyes and replied, you are not supposed to say that out loud. And there was a pause then, a real one, not calculated, not controlled, just a fraction of a second where something slipped, and she straightened slightly, her voice lower now, sharper. What did you hear? And I did not answer immediately. I let the silence stretch, because silence had power, and I said quietly, enough. And she took a step closer, closing the distance between us to less than 2 feet, and said, enough to be dangerous. And I felt my chest tighten for a moment, just one moment, and I pressed it down, pushed it back, because this was not the time for hesitation. And I said, enough to stop this. And she laughed then, not loudly, not dramatically, just a soft, controlled exhale, and said, you think you can stop something that has been running for 6 years? And I did not look away, not even for a second, and I replied, I think I can expose it. And her eyes sharpened again, her posture shifting, and she said, expose what? And I reached into my pocket slowly, pulling out my phone, turning it over, and pressing play at exactly 12:20 p.m., and the room filled with her own voice, recorded, precise, undeniable. 6 months was enough. He trusts the process now, and I watched her face as the words landed, as recognition set in, as calculation replaced confidence, and I let the recording continue, Stephen's voice following, for days. Total transfer $3.2 million. And Vanessa's expression changed, not dramatically, but enough to see the shift from control to assessment, and she said quietly, you recorded me. And I nodded once and replied, you documented yourself. And she took a step back then, just one, creating space, and her voice changed again, colder now, more direct. Do you know how many people thought they understood this? And I said nothing. I just let the recording play, letting her own words fill the silence, and she continued, speaking over it now. 3 before you. 3 who believed they had leverage. And I felt something collapse inside me for a second, just 1 second, because hearing that confirmed the pattern, confirmed the number, and I pressed my hand lightly against the table, grounding myself, then forced my voice steady and said, 3 who trusted you. And she smiled again, but this time it was different, sharper, almost amused, and she said, trust is the easiest variable to control. And I shook my head once and replied, not anymore. And she leaned slightly forward, her eyes locked on mine, and said, you are already too late. And I felt that line hit, harder than expected, because it aligned with everything, the message, the relocation at 10:32 a.m., the second location, and I said quietly, where is she? And for the first time, she did not answer immediately. She just watched me, her expression unreadable, and then she said, you still think this is about her? And I felt my breath catch for a second, just one, because that question shifted the frame, changed the scope, and I said, it is always about her. And she shook her head slowly, almost gently, and said, no, she was a disruption, a variable that needed to be contained. And I stepped forward then, closing the distance again, my voice lower now, controlled. She is my daughter. And Vanessa met my gaze without hesitation and said, she was a mistake. And the word landed like a final confirmation, cold, precise, and I felt my hand tighten again, just briefly, then release, because this was the moment to hold control, not lose it. And I said, you moved her at 10:32 a.m. And her eyes flickered, just slightly, just enough, to confirm it. And she said, you are paying attention now. And I nodded once and replied, I always was. And she gave a small, almost approving nod, then said, then you understand the next step. And I did not answer. I just watched her, waiting, and she leaned closer, her voice dropping to almost a whisper, for days. $3.2 million. Then everything resets. And I said quietly, "Not this time." And she straightened again, her expression returning to that calm, controlled surface. And she said, "You are not in control of this outcome." And I held her gaze and replied, "Neither are you anymore." And for a moment, just a moment, there was silence between us, heavy, final, and then my phone vibrated again on the table at exactly 12:23 p.m., and she glanced down at it before I could move, her eyes scanning the screen, and she read it out loud, her voice flat, precise, location confirmed. 2419 East Harbor. Second floor. She is there right now. It was 12:31 p.m. when we both moved at the same time. Not planned, not coordinated, just instinct. And I grabbed my keys from the counter while she reached for her phone. And for a split second we stood there, two people in the same house, but no longer on the same side. And I said, "I am going there," my voice steady, controlled, because hesitation would cost time. And she tilted her head slightly and replied, "You think you will get there before me?" And I did not answer that. I just turned and walked toward the door, because distance mattered now. Minutes mattered, and I stepped outside at 12:32 p.m., the sunlight too bright, too sharp, and I got into my car, starting the engine immediately. And as I pulled out of the driveway, I saw her in the rearview mirror, already on her phone, already moving, and I knew she was adjusting the plan, recalculating, just like she always did, and I pressed the accelerator harder than usual, merging onto the main road within 14 seconds, checking the time again, 12:33 p.m., and I said out loud, 8 minutes, because that was the distance, 2.7 miles to 2419 East Harbor, 8 minutes in light traffic, maybe 10 with delays, and I pushed the car forward, staying within control, not reckless, but precise, because this was not panic. This was execution, and my phone rang at 12:34 p.m., Sharon's name on the screen, and I answered immediately, placing it on speaker. "I am on the way." And she replied, "We have units 2 minutes out," her voice focused, direct, and I said, "Second floor." And she confirmed, "Second floor. Northeast corner. Access through the side entrance." And I nodded even though she could not see it and said, "I will be there in 6. And she paused for half a second before adding, "Do not go in alone." And I ended the call without answering, because that was not an option, not anymore. And I drove the remaining distance in exactly 6 minutes, pulling up to the building at 12:39 p.m., the same warehouse, the same number, 2419, but now everything felt different, sharper, more defined, and I parked about 40 feet from the side entrance, stepping out immediately, my hands steady, my breathing controlled, and I moved toward the door, each step deliberate, because this was the moment, the one that would decide everything. And I reached the entrance at 12:40 p.m., my hand on the metal handle, cold, solid, and I paused for 1 second, just one, because I needed to be clear, completely clear, and I said quietly, "I am here," before pushing the door open and stepping inside. And the air was different there, heavier, still, and I could hear something faint above me, a movement, a sound, and I moved toward the stairs immediately, taking them 2 at a time, reaching the second floor in less than 12 seconds, and I saw the door at the end of the hallway, slightly ajar, about 3 inches open, and I slowed down then, not out of fear, but out of precision, because rushing now would be a mistake, and I stepped closer, 1 step, then another, and I said softly, "Natalie," because I needed to confirm, needed to hear her, and there was a pause, just a second, then a voice, weak but clear, "Dad?" And everything stopped for a moment, just one moment, because hearing it again, here, now, changed everything, and I pushed the door open fully, stepping inside, and I saw her, sitting on a chair, her posture tense, her eyes wide, but alive, present, and I moved forward quickly, closing the distance between us in 3 steps, and I said, "I am here," and she looked at me, her voice shaking slightly as she said, "You should not have come alone," and I shook my head and replied, "You are coming with me." And she swallowed once, then said, "She knows," and I felt that land, sharp, immediate, and I asked, "Knows what?" And Natalie's eyes shifted slightly toward the doorway behind me, and she said, "Everything," and I turned instinctively, just slightly, just enough to see movement at the end of the hallway, shadows shifting, and I heard footsteps, more than one set, approaching fast, and my phone vibrated in my pocket at exactly 12:41 p.m., and I pulled it out quickly, seeing Sharon's name again, and I answered, "Where are you?" And she replied, her voice tighter now, "We are 60 seconds out." And I said, "Hurry," and ended the call, and I turned back to Natalie, placing my hand lightly on her shoulder, steadying both of us, and I said, "We leave now." And she nodded once. But before we could move, a voice came from the hallway, clear, controlled, unmistakable, and it said, "You made it faster than I expected." It was 12:42 p.m. when everything stopped feeling uncertain and started feeling final, because the voice in the hallway was calm, steady, and completely in control, and I did not turn immediately. I just stood there with my hand still on Natalie's shoulder, feeling the warmth of her presence, real, alive, after 187 days of absence, and I said quietly, "Stay behind me." And she nodded once, her breath uneven but steadying, and I took one step forward, then another, until I could see her clearly at the doorway, Vanessa, standing there like nothing had changed, like this was just another conversation. And she looked at me and said, "You always did underestimate timing." And I shook my head, slightly, and replied, "Not today." And there was a pause then, a brief one, where everything balanced on a single decision, and then we heard it, distant at first, then louder, sirens, multiple units, approaching fast, closing the distance in seconds, and Vanessa's expression shifted, just slightly, just enough to register, and she said, "You called them." And I answered, "I documented you." And the distinction mattered, even now, especially now, and she let out a slow breath, almost a laugh, and said, 6 years. $12 million. You think this ends here?" And I did not respond immediately, because there was nothing to add, nothing to argue, and the sound of boots on stairs filled the hallway, sharp, coordinated, precise, and within seconds, 2 agents appeared behind her, then 3 more, and one of them said, "Ma'am, step away from the door." And Vanessa did not move at first. She just looked at me, holding my gaze, and said quietly, "You were never supposed to see the full design." And I felt that line land, deeper than the rest, because it was true. I had not seen it. Not for years, not until it was almost complete. And I said, "You should have planned for that." And she smiled then, faint, controlled, and stepped back slowly, allowing the agents to move forward. And within seconds, the space shifted, control transferred. The room no longer hers, no longer mine, but something official, something final. And I turned back to Natalie, placing both hands lightly on her shoulders, and I said, "We are leaving." And she nodded, her eyes still wide, still processing, and we walked out together at 12:46 p.m., past the agents, past the hallway, down the stairs, and into the daylight that felt different now, clearer, more defined. And I did not look back, not at her, not at the building, because some things do not need a second look. And by 5 p.m. that evening, we were in a new apartment, 22 miles away from everything that had happened, sitting across from each other at a small kitchen table, and the silence between us was not empty anymore. It was full, heavy with everything we had survived, everything we had uncovered. And Natalie looked at me and said, "I thought you would not find me." And I shook my head once and replied, "I never stopped looking." And she held my gaze for a moment, then said, "She said you would not understand in time." And I exhaled slowly, because that was the truth she had built everything on: time, delay, control. And I said, "She was wrong about that." And we sat there for a while after that, not speaking, just breathing, just existing in a space that was finally real again. And I reached into my pocket and placed the Mont Blanc pen on the table between us. Its weight familiar, its meaning completely changed, and I looked at it for a moment before saying, "This was never just a pen." And Natalie nodded slowly, understanding more than she should have had to at 22 years old. And the sun moved across the room as the hours passed, quiet, steady, marking time in a way that felt honest again. And I realized something then, something simple but exact, that trust is not broken in a moment. It is reshaped over years, quietly, without notice, until one day it no longer belongs to you. And control does not begin with force. It begins with small permissions, given slowly, one decision at a time, until there is nothing left to question. And truth does not arrive loudly. It arrives in fragments, numbers, details, patterns that only make sense when it is almost too late. And as I sat there, looking at my daughter across that table, my phone vibrated once more at exactly 6:15 p.m., and I picked it up slowly, reading a single message from an unknown number that said, "There were not 3 before you. There were 7.